you, Roger. This is kind of weird because I'm up here to introduce him, and he just introduced me to introduce him. But he ought to be honored. How often are you introduced by the President of Canada? So that's... correct me if I'm wrong, Roger, but if I have my years right, you're just finishing your 6th year as President of National Farmers Union? And we'll be starting 7? So, okay, very good. Anyhow, one of the first things that Roger did after he became president was come down and try and deal with this grumpy curmudgeon in Kansas that wasn't doing much with NFU at the time and drug me back into activity within the organization. So, personal thank you to that. I've mostly been involved through the financial end of the organization for some years. Our books have never been as crystal clear and as open for observation as they are now. I think Martha did a wonderful job with that one bar graph that showed how much less we're drawing from investment returns at this point, and that's really significant. So he's been very fiscal responsibility. I call him tight. People call me tight, but that's a good thing. And so I will quit rambling now, and at this time, for the State of the Farmers Union address, is our National President, Roger Johnson from North Dakota. I got the state right. Thank you.
Thank you, Don. You know, it'll probably be quite a while before I live that Canada thing down. But that's okay, because one of the nice things about growing older is I forget a lot of stuff. And so you may remind me of this next year, and I probably will have forgotten. The one thing I do know, as someone who's mingled with folks from other states a lot, is that, and this isn't true for folks in Farmers Union, they are much, much brighter than that. But before I took this job, I was the Commissioner of Agriculture in North Dakota. And so with the national scene of ag commissioners, they weren't quite as sharp, although here in Minnesota, Dave certainly is. It was not unusual to find folks who would think North Dakota is someplace north of Canada. And so, Don, that maybe that's part of the reason that I referenced that. I really need to start by saying thank you. Thank you for the faith that you've shown in me. It's a great honor to serve as your national president. And I need to say a thank you, a special thanks for last night. For those of you folks who had extra glow sticks and happened to hang them around the neck of Elliot or Olive, it managed to keep them both fully entertained until almost 11 o'clock last night, and again this morning for another 2 hours. Elliot at one point said with glee, "Grandpa, this is such a great night. I'm winning all these prizes." And if any little story can tell why this organization is so important, maybe it's that. Because it really is and always has been about family. And I think that's what makes it so very special. So this is the 114th anniversary convention. We've been around for a long time. If there's anything that's been constant over all the years of our history, it's that we have always been advocates for family farmers. And we have always been a progressive, a strong, and a unified, for the most part, voice. And I think another important piece of this is that we have been a nonpartisan voice. And sometimes, I know for many of us, that's difficult. But when it comes time for us to make decisions on the national level about whether we're for this or against that or uncertain, the first place everyone on staff goes is to the policy book. And so I know that. I grew up in this organization. I am reminded, I don't think Gary Orman's in the crowd anymore, but many of you know Gary as a longtime staff member of North Dakota Farmers Union. I knew Gary as a kid who was about 3 or 4 years older than I was, and we rode the same school bus. And I knew Gary because his mom and dad, along with a number of neighbors, moms and dads, and my mom and dad, and those of us kids in the family, met maybe monthly, but certainly quite frequently, at the local rural schoolhouse for the New Home Local Farmers Union meetings, picnics, gatherings, etc. The reason I mention Gary Orman, well, I probably shouldn't tell this because, well, his politics aren't the same as his parents. But when I talk about the nonpartisan thing, what occurred to me is that while I grew up as a Democrat because that's kind of what we were in our family, not everyone in our neighborhood was. And not everyone around the tables of that little one-room schoolhouse, in fact, were all Democrats. But they were all committed Farmers Union members. And so I need to remind myself of that every now and then. We are, in fact, a nonpartisan organization that allows us to stand much stronger on principle because we're not pulled by some of the crazy things that often happen in the political arena. We come here as Democrats, as Republicans, as independents, and we make this a much, much stronger organization. We come from farms and ranches that operate literally thousands of acres to farmers who operate less than a half of an acre. And in both of those categories, we have full-time farmers and we have part-time farmers who are members. We come from places that operate in the way I would say is traditional agriculture, conventional agriculture. It goes by many names. We use the latest technology, the latest biotechnology, and we largely market commodities to farmers who operate CSAs, operate out of farmers market stands, some who operate organically. And yet we all share a common bond, because we, in many ways, face exactly the same challenges. We have much more in common than we have differences. And I think sometimes we need to remind ourselves of that, especially when we get in the heat of the policy debate sometimes. I'm proud of the work that we do, and I'm proud of the vigorous debate that we undertake. And I don't think I've ever seen a case at a convention where it got out of hand, but I know that there are occasions outside of the convention when some of us in agriculture start fighting and fussing over things that are far less important than the things that bind us together. 114 years ago, one of the enormous challenges that we faced as a new farm organization and as farmers at that time was access to a market. It was, in economic terms, we call it economic concentration. We call it not enough buyers for what we have to sell, or not enough suppliers for the things that we have to buy as inputs on our farms and ranches. And in many ways, that was what helped become an undergirding element of what led to us becoming organized. Facing sort of this large concentrated economic marketplace that in many ways, even though it's different, is very similar yet today. We today are in the throes in conventional agriculture of dealing with 6 major seed and chemical suppliers. Soon to be 5, more likely 4, and I would argue even more likely than that, 3. We're going to be down to just a few choices. And what is certain when that happens are 2 things. There will be fewer choices for our members of where to go for those inputs. And those inputs will be priced higher than they otherwise would be were there robust competition in the marketplace. Those 2 things are certain. They are economic facts. I mean, that's just the way the economy works. And so I think it's incumbent upon us to remain true to our history and to hold up to the public the fact that we shouldn't be tolerating these continued mergers and acquisitions. And it just isn't in the grain arena. Just as true that it is dealing with grains is the fact that many of the livestock producers now are faced with fewer and fewer places to market your animals, fewer and fewer places that will slaughter them. And in fact, the biggest of those few big players are now in fact foreign owned. And even more troubling, in one of those cases, owned by a very, very large communist country that has for a long while and continues to exercise significant management influence, if I can say it kindly, over the largest corporations that operate within and without its borders. And so, while we faced this challenge years and years and years ago as we were founded, in many ways, we face the same challenges today. And as we get more focused on what's happening in the economy in the past year or so, I'm sure it is not lost on anyone in this audience that the net farm income projections coming out of USDA now are at less than half of what they were just 3 short years ago. And that's no big surprise because in many cases across the marketplace, the prices that we can sell our commodities into that marketplace for are roughly half of what they were just a few short years ago as well. And for a while, that was more true in grains and livestock. In the last year or so, the livestock complex has sort of made up for lost time, and we're seeing the same sort of substantial downward pressure that's happening as a result of that. Economists, when they talk about agriculture, they often will acknowledge that when prices go up, the input costs come up directly and rapidly behind the market prices. But when market prices trend down, input prices are, this is the economic term, sticky, which is to mean that they tend to stay high for quite a while longer, and then they begin to bend down. And so ultimately we feel that the system becomes somewhat more in balance, but there's a lot of pain that's extracted along the way. And we are beginning to see quite clearly now in the financial arena the results of some of that. If you read closely the reports of machinery auctions, You will find occasionally auction reports where market prices for used machinery, relatively new used machinery, because the good years have produced a whole lot of relatively new machinery across the agricultural landscape, those values have fallen in half in some cases already. Land values not nearly so much, but beginning to trend down in various places across the country. All of which suggests that there is growing significant financial stress, particularly as it relates to conventional agriculture. And I would argue that the folks we most need to worry about are the folks who began farming in the last 5 or 10 years, because they started at a time of relatively high market price. Historically, you look at the long-term trends, very high market prices with high costs associated with them, and are now trying to figure out, having not been able to set aside money during the good years because they just started, how do they survive in the face of this sticky cost price squeeze that's happening on the downside? It's all very real. I'm not here to suggest that we are re-entering the 1980s, because after all, there are lots and lots of things that are very different in today's economy, probably the biggest one being interest rates, which make an enormous difference. But it is nonetheless very real, and it is very real financial stress that is occurring. I think it is also the case that the economic concentration that I talked about earlier is adding to that cost price squeeze, because the folks we're selling to are fewer and fewer buyers in a position to squash prices a little lower than they otherwise would be able to were there competition out there, and there are fewer and fewer input suppliers with the sort of the same market dynamic that is at operation. Now, we fight long and hard in this sort of area of the economy relative to our membership, family farmers and ranchers across the landscape, because we know that we have an economic system, the model of which is the envy of the world. There's no country on earth who is able to produce food in the abundant fashion, in the relatively safe fashion, and at such an affordable price to consumers as is this country. No one on earth does this job better. But again, all of these things I've been talking about put strain on that model. At the same time that we focus on those economic forces dealing with what I think is probably the vast bulk of our membership, it should not go unnoticed that the fastest growing, very visible part of our membership is kind of a different kind of farmer than what I've just been talking about. They are, in many ways, the CSAs, the farmers markets, the organics, the folks that are doing direct from farm to consumer kinds of folks who have a different market dynamic that is at play. And in many cases, as I see living out in the Washington, D.C. area, farmers markets abound across that whole area. And most of the customers at those farmers markets tend to be relatively well-off folks like I am, who don't dicker about prices. In fact, if anything, they might say, I know you want $3, but how about $4? You know, it's no big deal. Or you want 4, I'll give you a $5 bill. Why is that? Well, I think there are lots of reasons for it, but certainly a compelling reason for it is I believe there is an ever-increasing desire on the part of consumers to know more and more and more about their food and about where it comes from. And we as an organization have always worked hard to make certain that there's room in our organization for both types of farmers. I don't think there is a state in the country that provides a better example of that dynamic, sometimes that tension between these two different types of agriculture, than Minnesota, where I can imagine all around this urban area, you have the same kinds of new farmers and farmers markets and CSAs, et cetera, that I've just been talking about that are around the DC area. And yet you don't have to go very far outside of the metropolitan area to find a whole lot of the membership of Minnesota Farmers Union that are very traditional, conventional farmers, continuing to operate as they have for many, many years. I think it's also important for us to at least think about this. It is my belief that not only do these two different types of agriculture have much in common, but they, in fact, as the years go by, are going to find that in many areas, they can learn and benefit from one another. I remember going to NDSU and taking soils classes, even though my major area was in economics, and having the definition of soil being provided to me as the structure or the medium to hold up a plant, which, if you think about it, doesn't really much matter whether it's Red River Valley black earth or whether it's the sandy junk that we farm out in Turtle Lake, North Dakota. If it's just a medium to hold up a plant, and in what we have learned so much in recent years, and I think much of this being driven by sort of this new emerging type of agriculture, is that in fact, there are more organisms beneath the surface of the soil than there are above. And we're just beginning to learn about that. And as we learn more and more about that, that's going to help all of us, regardless of what type of farmer or rancher that we are. And so we need always to be very open-minded about that. We need always to be standing for the things that we've stood for. It's why we, over the many years, have said we need a strong research title in the Farm Bill, and we want research to be done on all different kinds of areas, because after all, research in this new discovery of information is what ought to guide our policy decisions going forward, right? It shouldn't just be, well, we've always done it that way. And it is why we've always been strong advocates for the conservation title of the Farm Bill, because we all know, many of us, our forefathers learned in a very, very harsh way during the Dust Bowl years of the 30s of the need for conservation on our soil, our land, our water, our air. And it's why we've always then, therefore, been strong supporters of the conservation title. And it's also why we have been strong supporters of a safety net. And a safety net means different things to different folks. For those of us involved in traditional convention agriculture, for so many years that safety net has been some sort of price protection, coupled with some sort of production insurance, So when difficult times hit, we could survive for another year so we could farm into the future. And that meant there are really two big variables that we face in agriculture, and always will. Price and weather, right? Those are the big, huge things that we have little control over. In the short term, we might think we have some control over prices. We can do all this stuff with the futures contract. We can lock in things in advance, et cetera, et cetera. But you end up in a 8 or 9 or 10-year downward price trend, and those opportunities don't give you the opportunity to lock in profit. In fact, more often, they simply give you the opportunity to limit your losses on the downside. And at the same time, when disaster strikes, we need a strong crop insurance program. So that's the safety net that we all sort of look at and support for traditional agriculture. I wonder if for this new age kind of agriculture, these folks that farm around the cities, in fact, in many cases in the middle of the cities, their safety net might be wrapped up more in the kind of research that's needed to help them figure out how to do the things that need to be done differently. It may be in how do we deal with the new food safety regulations that are coming out that are going to impact us very directly, because we, in fact, instead of harvesting bushels of wheat that go to the elevator and go to et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, before they come back in a loaf of bread, we, in fact, are harvesting crops that are going directly to the consumer, and we're going to have to deal. None of us want there to be food safety issues associated with that, and so we all support the fact that the government needs to regulate that. But at the same time, we need to make sure that that's done in a reasonable way, that we are educated in the appropriate way, that we have the right kind of regulations that apply, and very likely, we need to continue working for the kinds of changes that have been happening in recent years with crop insurance that make it more and more applicable to the changing kind of agriculture that we see so much of. Anytime we talk about the state of the organization, I think it's important for us to do a little bit of looking back at what the last year is, and to look ahead a little bit for what the future might bring. Just as an aside, the looking ahead piece, I'm a big believer in the wisdom of crowds. And the wisdom of crowds is what comes through in the policy that comes out of this convention. So I might have some observations about the future, but frankly, it is your observations about the future that are going to be much more dispositive in terms of guiding this organization in the future as you deliberate policy over these next couple of days. But as we look past at the last year, we are in a time when Congress is not held in high esteem. That comes as no surprise to any of us in the room. At a time when Congress doesn't get a lot done, that certainly comes as no surprise either. And I don't want to get into the business of saying that Congress is the problem, and I'm not going to go down that road, because we have a system of government in this country that we need to figure out how we can preserve, not undermine and destroy, as too many voices out there, I think, are focused on doing right now. We had some important wins in the past year. Late in the year, there was a railroad. There was a train running down the tracks at a high rate of speed that had led to a big cut in crop insurance that, by God, there is no way you're going to reverse this thing. And as an organization, we were among the first publicly to say, wait a minute, just because the majority leaders of both houses of Congress and the White House think it's a smart idea to cut $3 billion out of crop insurance in order to come up with a new budget deal, we disagree. And we stood up to fight that. There was no way that that agreement was going to be derailed. But what we got in place of derailing it was the extraction of a promise from the leadership in both houses of Congress that they, in fact, even though they were going to pass the law making the cuts, turning them into law, they were going to undo it in the very near future. And in fact, as it turns out, it wasn't more than a couple of weeks later that they did just exactly that. That was an important win. And it's important not just because of what it did. It's important because of what's coming at us. In the years I've been paying attention to what goes on in Washington, I don't think a year has gone by but what there haven't been attempts to cut important safety net programs, crop insurance in particular, from administrations of both political stripes and from members of Congress of both political stripes. It will always be the case. In particular, since crop insurance now is the largest single cost item of the Farm Bill, second to the nutrition title, which I don't think many of us are going to argue we should cut to take food out of the mouths of folks who are already hungry. And so this will be a focal point. You go where the money is when you want to make cuts. And so that win was important because of what it may help undergird in the future. We were able to play a meaningful role in rolling back in sort of an internal and quiet effort underway about sort of squashing cooperative services at USDA and keeping them intact. The public doesn't know much about that, and arguably a lot of the public doesn't care much about that. But after all, the cooperative side of a triangle is a pretty important side of the triangle to this organization, and that was, I think, a significant win for us. We were directly involved in many ways in making sure that the new food safety regulations coming out of FSMA were initially pulled back, a rare thing in Washington, D.C., where an administration or an agency puts out a set of rules for comment and finds that the comments are so profoundly different than what was contemplated in the rule that they say, you know what, let's just take the rule back and we'll start over. And we played a role in that. And that's an important piece of victory for that safety net that's important to that other kind of farmer that I was talking about earlier. And we played a big role in making sure that mandatory price reporting got reauthorized this year. It's been a focal point of this organization for many, many years, because without it, the economic power of the few that buy from us is enhanced since they can keep prices away from us. And so mandatory price reporting is a way of saying we're going to level the playing field so that as farmers and ranchers, when we have animals to sell into the marketplace, at least we know what they might be worth in the marketplace of buyers and sellers, relatively competitive. And so we got that reauthorized. We got reauthorized the Grain Standards Act with some improvements made. We were a central role in making sure that Congress, in both houses, separately demonstrated their belief to the administration that trade agreements needed to deal with currency manipulation. Now that may seem like sort of a Pyrrhic victory because, after all, in TPP, currency manipulation isn't dealt with there. But in fact, just getting Congress to tell the negotiators, by God, you guys better start focusing on this, I think is a major victory, because it is the largest part of the problem that we face in the trade arena. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but getting that acknowledged, I think, was important. And when this administration first came into power, there was a lot of hope across the countryside that many of our members were a part of, as the Department of Justice and USDA went out and did all these hearings and talked about the need for some sort of reform in GIPSA so that folks who were selling into the marketplace would be accorded fair treatment, only to find out that after USDA proposed the rules, and in one case even finalized rules, Congress subsequently came in and reversed it. Guess what? A quiet piece of hard work from our legislative staff in the office and others, you know, a nice little story from John Oliver on TV that sort of called out the practices of some in the meat industry, in poultry industry in particular, had an impact. And the quiet word that emerged to us from our sources in Congress was, you know what, we're not going to put that GIPSA rider on anymore. We don't want to be sort of called out, because he had a scroll running on TV of every member of Congress who voted wrong. And in fact, when he said they voted wrong, that was exactly the position that Farmers Union was in accord with. And so, small victory maybe, quiet victory, yes, an important victory, no doubt, because we are now going to get some of those rules put back in place before this administration leaves town. That's a big deal, and I hope folks talk to the Secretary about it. As we look ahead, I think it's important for us to think a little bit about the last Farm Bill. And when I say the last Farm Bill, it seems like it's the Farm Bill that we're just starting to see. It is the 2014 Farm Bill that took 5 years to get passed, and it's, you know, a 5-year Farm Bill. So what does that say about the next Farm Bill? Probably ought to be thinking about it. Unfortunately, we still don't know what's happening with the current Farm Bill as we design the next one, but nonetheless, we need to be thinking about that. And that is something that you will hopefully provide some more guidance on over the next couple of days. There is in your convention bag a survey dealing with Farm Bill provisions, not so much the policy piece. You guys will give us that direction through policy guidance, but about some of the particulars relating to the Farm Bill and some of the anecdotes that you might be able to share with us that are important as we go up on the Hill to tell the story about what we want the next Farm Bill to look like. So I'd encourage you to fill them out, return them to the registration desk at the back of the hallway, and let us know how we need to be dealing with this next Farm Bill. Every year, the National Board sets priorities. At the convention, you all tell us what the policies are, but literally, if you go through the policy book, there are probably hundreds of different policies. And it's helpful that we focus. If you're going to get anything done, especially in a political environment, you need to focus. You need to say the same thing over and over and over and over the same way until you're so sick of hearing it yourself that it finally begins to catch on with a few folks. And so focus is important. in this last year, the board has directed us that one of the priority areas is country of origin labeling. No wonder why. This is an issue that Farmers Union has owned from the beginning, going back to 1984, and going back several farm bills. It's an issue that we have supported for two very simple reasons. Number one, we believe that if consumers want to know what's in their food, we should tell them. If consumers want to know what country food is produced in, we should tell them. It's a fairly simple thing. It's a basic premise of economics. The consumer is always right. Tell them what they want to know. And secondly, we're pretty proud of what we do as producers. And we'd like to have our name on those products that are sold to those consumers. So we were deeply involved in this fight for much of the year. I'm not going to go into the details of it except to make two major points. Number one, when the big packers sued USDA, we, in fact, ponied up a bunch of money. Many of you are on the fundraising end of this thing, contributed yourself, went out and asked others to contribute money for the legal effort, and we intervened in the lawsuit on the side of the government against the packers. I actually sat and listened at one of the court hearings. You might be interested to know what the packers' argument was. Their argument, if you boil it all down, was pretty simple. Their argument was that the law and the rule were illegal because they were unconstitutional. They were unconstitutional, that telling consumers where their food comes from was unconstitutional because it violated the packers' First Amendment right to free speech. And that argument was that the right to freedom of speech included the right to not tell folks what you didn't want them to know about the stuff that you were selling to them. Honest to God, that was their argument. Now, the good news is 4 different decisions came out of the courts. We won every one of those 4 decisions, hands down. Every argument they made, we won at every level of the judicial process. So that's the first point I make. Second point I'd make wasn't quite the same story when it came to the WTO. At the WTO, and this was an action encouraged by the multinational meat packers, the governments of Canada and Mexico took us to dispute resolution at the WTO, argued that this law was in violation of the WTO standards because it discriminated against them for a variety of reasons. And even though we won hands down 4 different legal decisions in this country, we lost 4 subsequent decisions at the WTO. Now, it is instructive, I think, to think a little bit about how you resolve disputes at the WTO versus how you resolve them in our judicial system. You all know our system pretty well. The WTO system is a little different, and it kind of works like this. When it comes to conflicts of interest by arbiters, but it doesn't matter, no such thing. The final decision rendered against the U.S. Cool Law was rendered by a 3-judge panel. By the way, they weren't judges. They were trade officials in their former life, now employed by companies who did business on the international scale. And the chairman of that panel was a Mexican national who used to negotiate for the Mexican government on trade deals, ruling on a case brought by the Mexican government and the Canadian government against us. We would never tolerate such, our system would not contemplate such a blatant conflict of interest. Any judge presented with that situation would have recused himself or herself long before it was ever presented with it, and certainly on appeal it would have been thrown out. But at the WTO, it's a different deal. And I think the Cool decision simply provides the latest example of what's wrong with our trade policies in this country. And this is the second major issue that the board has established as a priority for us to talk about, and that is trade and TPP in particular. As you all know, you took a position at the last convention to oppose TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I think it's instructive before we look at the next trade agreement to look at previous agreements to see what the results compare to what was promised. The last trade agreement that we entered into, for which we have any evidence, was KORUS, the Korean-U.S. Free Trade Agreement. We entered into that about 4+ years ago. We now have 3 years of economic data, of trade data, about the performance of that particular agreement. If you look at that data and you compare it to the promises that are made, there are some issues that pretty quickly emerge. We were promised, before the Korean agreement went into force, that there would be 70,000 new jobs created because we're going to see a whole bunch of new trade, and this new trade is going to increase economic activity, and that economic activity is going to create 70,000 new jobs. In fact, what we see from the trade results of the Korean agreement is that we lost 75,000 to 90,000 jobs. We didn't add a single new job. We lost, on a net basis now, on a net basis, we didn't create new jobs, we lost jobs. Why did that happen? A very simple reason. If you just look at the trade balance between Korea and the US, the difference between imports and exports is a very important measurement, because that difference, if imports are larger than exports, it means that we have a trade deficit. It means that we bought more stuff than we sold, and that deficit means that the stuff that we bought was made by jobs over there, right? I mean, that's pretty simple economics. And in fact, what happened with the Korean trade deficit is it worsened. We had a deficit. We had a generally upsloping line to the right underneath the deficit, meaning the deficit was gradually getting smaller until the year after the Korean agreement went into effect, and it began sloping the other way, and the deficit now is twice as large as it was before the agreement was entered into. And so we need to think about why that would be the case. And in particular, when it comes to the TPP, in my view, the biggest single reason that we should oppose TPP is because if you look at the last 40 years of trade data, we have a trade deficit in this country that is getting deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. Now, can you blame it on every trade agreement? I don't know. But you have to look at the preponderance of evidence over time. And I think any rational person looking at that would conclude that if the deficit's getting deeper and deeper and deeper, and that's a bad thing, you should do something different. Now, the biggest single cause of the trade deficit is currency manipulation. I talked about that earlier. The biggest single cause of the trade deficit is currency manipulation. Very simply, all countries do to manipulate currency is they go into our currency market, the dollar market, buy dollars, driving up the value of the US dollar, lowering the value of their currency, and guess what? The stuff that we are buying and selling between the two countries, suddenly what we have for sale gets more expensive, what they sell to us gets cheaper, And so what happens? We buy more of their stuff, and they sell, and we sell less stuff to them. It's very simple economics. And the result of that trade deficit today is a 3% drag in our economy. Imagine how much better off we would be as a country if we had, instead of a 1% growth rate or maybe a 2% growth rate, depending on the data you look at, maybe 0%, depending on how far you want to go back. We have a very small growth rate, 1 to 2%. If you added 3 points to it, think of the difference it would make in terms of economic activity in this country. And so we need to fix that. And that's why that item I referred to earlier about getting Congress to weigh in on this question is so important. Unfortunately, the administration didn't do it. When they negotiated the final pieces of the TPP, they had some language in about currency manipulation, but it had absolutely zero ability to do thing one to deal with it. It basically said the country's Treasury folks ought to sit down and talk once in a while so that you can talk about what's wrong with currency manipulation. But if in fact somebody's doing it, there's no ability to sort of hold them accountable and reverse those damages. So the trade agreement piece is something that I think we've been on the right side of for a long, long while. And I think we are gradually winning this argument that the Congress needs to establish as a directive to our trade negotiators that they in fact ought to strive to achieve balanced trade, not just more trade. I mean, right now we just tell the negotiators we want more trade. More trade is good, right? We don't care whether it's imports or exports. It's like you on your farm saying, you know, Ellen wants more money coming through the bank account, Charlie. And so, but she doesn't care whether it's income or expenses. I'm not suggesting that that'd be the case. You're both too smart to let that happen. But we as a country aren't smart enough to figure out how to tell our negotiators that there's a difference between imports and exports. We just tell them we want more trade. We need to tell them we want balanced trade. The third big issue that the board has prioritized for us is dealing with the renewable fuel standard and the impacts of climate in the changing weather patterns on this earth that we all live in. And it's no secret that we have been strong supporters of the renewable fuel standard for many, many, many years for lots and lots of reasons. But certainly a big one is because it provides economic opportunity for us on the farm. Another big one is that in terms of actual legislation that we have on the books in this country to deal with greenhouse gases, the renewable fuel standard is in fact a law that helps us deal with this problem. Corn ethanol, by over 30%, has fewer greenhouse gas emissions than gasoline, its competitor. And so it's a policy that helps when we want to be leaders across the globe about changes that we are faced relative to climate. So it's an economic boon for agriculture, but it's also the right thing to do for the environment. And I think it's a good thing for consumers. I mean, studies have shown that just the fact that we've got this ethanol out there in the fuel supply has resulted in a $1 decrease in the price of gasoline because of competition. And really, at its core, the only reason you need the RFS is to make sure that the oil companies allow ethanol a fair chance to compete against gasoline. There's no requirement that you or anyone else buy ethanol. None. Zero. There is only a requirement that if you want to, it should be available to you in the marketplace, and then you can make your own choice. That's the beauty of the RFS. And I think the real harm that has happened with the dilly-dallying that EPA has done relative to the RFS in the last several years isn't the damage it's done to corn ethanol. Corn ethanol has largely achieved the target that was laid out in 2007 in terms of the amount of corn ethanol that's going into the market. 15 billion gallons. Last year we produced like 14.7 billion gallons. We've got capacity to do like 15.5 billion gallons. We've hit that target. But the genius of the RFS is it was a long-term plan that said by the year 2022, we want 36 billion gallons of biofuels in the market. And it's just the first part that we're turning to corn for ethanol. The rest of it is this advanced technology, cellulosic ethanol and other advanced biofuels that are a more complicated, a more risky economic venture for companies to engage in. And they're only going to do it if they have the certainty that if they produce that fuel, they will be able to access the market. That was the genius of the RFS that Congress passed into law. And the action that EPA has taken in the last several years to undermine those targets has served as an enormous disincentive to investments, such that something in excess of $13 billion that we knew was scheduled to be invested in this new technology has vanished just like that, left the country, gone to other countries around the globe. And so we will continue to fight for the RFS and for other issues relative to climate change, because it's the right thing to do, not just for us, not just for our members, not just for this country. It's the right thing to do for everyone on this planet. Now, I need to switch gears a bit and bring this to a close, but I'd be remiss if I didn't talk a little bit about education, which is, of course, the base of our triangle. It seems like in today's political environment, and even in our social environment, facts seem to mean less and less. They seem to be less and less important. And what is interesting, if you look at a lot of the sociological research that's being done, people tend to trust people they know more than experts in almost any field. It doesn't really seem like it makes sense, but that's the deal. Social media in particular has enabled this to sort of manifest itself across all of society, not just in this country, but beyond. And so I think the base of the triangle is more and more and more important. We need to be educating. We need to be using clean, clear, crisp facts. And then those facts should drive the policy that we strive for. And those arguments based on that policy, undergirded by those facts, should be what Congress and other legislatures use to make their decisions on public policies. And so we have put a lot of emphasis on that piece in recent years. We have rebuilt a number of our education programs. Of course, the All States Camp has been a long-standing core of what we do in terms of education programs. But we have reinvigorated the Women's Conference. We've got some 150 women over the last several years who have attended it and are learning things about farm management and leadership and transitioning from generation to generation. Sometimes, guys, women think differently than we do. And the fact of the matter is, most research has suggested that different ways of approaching a problem, when combined, lead you to a better solution. And so we need to be thinking about how it is that we can engage more women in this organization, in the decision-making in this country, and that's why we've put emphasis on that. But it's also important that we continue to renew. As I look across the room, there are honestly more young people I see in the audience today than 7 years ago when I first stood here, but I see still a lot of bald, gray-haired men. The women are all young, but some of you men are pretty shiny. And so, yeah, Vincent sits right up front. It's not your teeth that shine either. Not that they don't, of course. It is why we have put more and more resources into beginning farmer programs, why we created the BFI, the Beginning Farmers Institute. It's why we continue to support All States Camp and all those youth programs that occur in every state that has an active organization and the economic ability, the financial wherewithal to support an education program. It's why we have put more resources into the Farmer Veteran Coalition, because not just to honor our returning veterans, which is important enough in its own right all by itself, but because we need some of the skills that they have learned to be integrated into this industry we call agriculture. It's why we continue, as I indicated, supporting All States Camp, and it's why next year we're going to take this all up another notch. Instead of standalone events that are happening in different places, next year in San Diego at the National Convention, 2 days in advance of the convention, we are going to convene a large beginning farmer, rancher, leadership, and other, I'm not sure if we've settled on all the name, conference. And we are going to invite folks who have been involved in all the different kinds of leadership programs that many of your states have been involved with over the last number of years. Anyone who's ever been a part of BFI since we started it, folks in the TAG program or the LEAD program or the Fellows program or all those different programs are all going to be invited to attend. I tell you this because if you're invited, you need to sign up early, because we will have an absolute cap. We entered into the negotiations on that convention site years ago and signed the contracts. We're in the process of squeezing more room out of that, and we're able to get commitments enough in advance so we know we can do the conference. But we're going to step it up a notch, because it will hopefully be less drain on some of our employees that spend a whole lot of time putting on different events, and at the same time bring more value to more people. And it's another place where our premier sponsors have really stepped up to provide the bulk of all the financing for that FUE and FUI Foundation, put in the bulk of the money that's going to underwrite that conference. So let's take this as another opportunity to thank them for that contribution. As you know, in terms of education, we also have put a big emphasis on farm safety, and I understand not many of you have taken advantage of the video room yet. I really do encourage you to take advantage of that. At least get a picture, a sense of what's going on with those videos, so you can be part of the sales force to get it out to folks across the country. I need to conclude by talking a bit about membership, because at the end of the day, we are only as strong as you are. We are only as strong as our members are. And while it is true that the state that added the most members of any state in the country last year is North Dakota, They added 4,500 members. That's a big deal. Congratulations, North Dakota. While it is true that that is very important, it is even more true that if those 4,500 members had been added in states where the membership is very small, we would get a bigger political result from that. The North Dakota folks know everyone in their congressional delegation by name. It is no problem for them to send a big crowd of folks to the fly-in and get in and visit with every one of their 3 members of the congressional delegation. And it's good that they do that. It's also good they send extra people because it helps us beef up the teams that go and visit with congressional members from states where there are more members of Congress than there are members from the state farmers union organization that are there to lobby those members of Congress. So we need this membership focus to not just be about adding members in states that are strong. We need to be adding members in states where we really, really need to grow. And if I'm going to highlight one more state, Vincent, it's Hawaii. 45% membership growth in the state of Hawaii last year. Pretty awesome. No one had a bigger percentage growth. And it's really interesting because when I go to Hawaii and watch that phenomenon, and when Vincent comes to the board meeting and talks about the phenomenon of what's happening on the islands, it is almost identical to what I started this speech talking about, where it was neighbors gathered around the local country school talking about Farmers Union. It's where we were 3 generations ago in some of our strong Farmers Union states. That's where Hawaii is today. And the excitement and the energy lets them do meetings every single month and get literally hundreds of people to show up for them. Pretty cool. You're doing something right. Thank you. I talked earlier about the need to focus on issues. It's also important in membership, and it's why we have put resources focusing on Hawaii. It's also why we've put resources focusing on what I call the Hastings states. The membership growth there is positive, but it's not spectacular. It is a hard, slow grind to get new members in traditional farm country. And we know that, we understand it, we're going to do everything we can to help. And it is the case that in every single strong state we have in this organization, there is a strong Farmers Union insurance operation associated with that. We know that that symbiotic relationship between our farm organization and our insurance operations is very, very important. It's more difficult in Hastings because it's not a Farmers Union insurance. We understand that. But it's no less important that we have robust membership growth in those 6 states that are served by that mutual insurance company, which tends to share a lot of the values that we have here as well. I think if there is one other piece of good news that I would share relative to membership growth and insurances, it is a renewed attitude coming from QBE, the owner of Farmers Union Insurance Company, which we created and used to own and then sold, and it was resold, and QBE ended up with it. It's no secret that they have struggled for many, many, many years, and it is not the case that everything is great today, but at least I can tell you that when I talk to their leading officials, there's a whole different attitude. And nothing changes results better, more effectively, than a focused, positive, changed attitude on trying to get things done. And at least we've got that from them. Now we have to continue to focus, hold our feet to the fire, and try and get that membership to grow all across the country. I've talked about a lot of things, in a lot of places where I think we've made significant progress, but there are also places where there is much work that is yet to be done. Despite this progress, there's a lot of work. There are key programs to protect. We have programs that enjoyed widespread support in the past, like the Renewable Fuel Standard and COOL, that are struggling today. But that's not the reason or a reason for us to step back and say, you know what, we tried that, we did it, it doesn't work, we're going to give up. It's all the more reason to double down. It is exactly the reason why we've been around for 114 years. And over the remaining days of this convention, it is your job, the most important thing that is done at this convention is your job as delegates to tell us what's important for us to focus on and in what manner in the coming year and years. I have every confidence that you will do it, and you will do it very well. Thank you very much.